Dickie Dread, The New Age Travellers, A History, 1960 to 1990. Chapter 2, Free Festivals and Punk. Free Festivals. It didn't start in a muddy field with bass bins and bongos. It started with a refusal, a shared unspoken answer to a world that cost too much, pleased too hard and offered too little. The Free Festival wasn't born from thin air. It rose out the squat kitchens, protest camps, psychedelic dens and punk cellars of the 1960s and 1970s. A people's celebration, a people's resistance. The word free did double duty. Free as in no ticket, no fences, no wristbands or queuing at box offices. But also free as in freedom, no curfews, no headliners, no bosses. It was DI culture on a national scale. Music, mud, magic, mayhem. Sometimes a few dozen turned up. Sometimes thousands. Sometimes nobody went home. Before Stonehenge and Windsor there was Woodstock, held across 3 days in August 1969 on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York. It was planned for 50,000 and got over 400,000. The fences didn't stand a chance. Ticket booths were abandoned. The promoters gave up trying to contain it. What had been sold as a music and arts fair turned into a cultural event of seismic proportions, part concert, part commune, part survival mission. It wasn't exactly free, not in the original plan, but it became free by force of numbers. The sheer human flood made it unpoliceable, unticketable, unmanageable. Roads were gridlocked for miles. Acts had to be helicoptered in. Some, like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, had never played live together before. Others, like Janis Joplin, were already legends. Jimi Hendrix's set, which closed the festival to a shrinking cloud at dawn, wasn't just historic, it was a declaration. His version of the Star-Spangled Banner, bent and broken through feedback and distortion, sounded like a war being fought in the sky. The conditions were dire. Rainstorms, overflowing toilets, medical shortages, hunger, exhaustion. And yet, nobody burned it down. People built tent cities out of ponchos, they shared food, acid, cigarettes, water. They dosed heavily. LSD was passed around freely, sometimes carelessly. Bad trips sent some to the medical tents. Others wandered off into the woods and were never seen again. Brown acid became a cautionary tale, announced from the stage, but even so, the peace held. Excuse me. Mainstream media didn't know what to make of it. Some paper praised the harmony, calling it a miracle of peace and music. Others panicked, screaming about drugs, nudity and moral collapse. Conservative voices saw it as the collapse of American values. But for the counterculture it was a moment of proof. A self-organised, peaceful mass gathering without corporate control or state permission. A new kind of village, muddy, wild and real. Woodstock was messy and unrepeatable. The later attempts, especially Woodstock 99, proved that the magic didn't come from the name, but from the time, the people, the refusal to be sold anything. Still, it set the tone. In the UK, it lit a fire under artists, anarchists and dropouts alike. What if you could throw a party without permission? What if the land was yours for a weekend? Long before Stonehenge became a drum circle, or Windsor became a war zone, there was the Isle of Wight Festival. A stormy blueprint for what was possible and what could go wrong. Held annually from 1968 to 1970, it was the UK's first real attempt at a large-scale, open-air counterculture gathering. What started with a few thousand attendees in Farmersfield exploded in 1970 into a festival over 600 people, bigger than Woodstock, wilder than the authorities ever imagined, and far more unsustainable. The 1970 event, headlined by Jimi Hendrix, was just weeks before his death, became the stuff of British legend. The Who, Miles Davis, Jethro Tull, The Doors, Joan Baez, Leonard Cohen, all took the stage, but it wasn't just the music, it was the atmosphere of defiance and sprawling encampments, the idealists on the hill refusing to pay for entry, shouting "Wally!" over and over, a chant that would echo through festival fields for years to come. Wally was actually a missing dog at the time, but the name Wally will become more significant later in the story. The festival grounds, initially ticketed and fenced, became a chaotic patchwork of paying punters, fence hoppers and committed freeloader anarchists. Makeshift camps sprung up in surrounding hills and fields, beyond the control of the organisers. Many of these were radicals who believed music should never be commodified. and that the land, even a muddy hillside on a tiny island, could be free. This conflict between inside and outside defined the event. Thousands gathered on Desolation Hill, a rise outside the official arena, refusing to pay or move. The Wallies, a loose-knit group of travelling anarchists, declared the hill liberated territory, flying banners and preaching freedom. Fights broke out. Police tried to clear the camps. Generators caught fire. The air buzzed with acid, amphetamines, rage and idealism. The press called it anarchy. The government called for legislation. The Isle of Wight Act, passed in 1971, made it illegal to hold overnight open-air gatherings of more than 5,000 people without a licence, a direct response to what had unfolded. In short, no more Woodstocks in Britain. But the genie had already escaped the bottle. The Isle of Wight showed that people would gather, with or without permission, that music and protest could blur, that fields could become cities, and the establishment would always try to put a lid back on it. In the muddy aftermath, the name Whalley became a symbol, not just of a person or a dog, but of a movement, free, chaotic, hard to pin down, a shout in the dark that said, "We are still here." Held from the 24th to 26th July 1970 in Eccleston Common, near Worthing, Sussex, Fun City was a chaotic, muddy explosion of anarchic spirit that set the tone for decades to follow. Originally intended as a paid event organised by countercultural writer Mick Farren and the International Times, the funding collapsed days before the gates were due to open. Instead of cancelling, the organisers threw open the Commons and declared it free. What followed was a spontaneous, unscripted gathering of 10,000 plus freaks, bikers, punks before their time, heads, dropouts and wild-eyed dreamers. The line-up was punk before punk existed. MC5, the Pink Fairies, Edgar Broughton Band, Kevin Ayers, Skin Alley, the Deviants all played for free. Farron called it a controlled disaster, but it was also a statement that people would come together for music, rebellion and community without needing tickets or fences. There were no food stalls, no toilets, no security, just raw culture in the open air. It was dirty, strange and electric. Fun City was not a festival made for spectators, but for participants. In its disorder, it laid the foundation for Windsor, Stonehenge and the entire free festival movement that would ripple through the 1970s and 1980s. If Woodstock was the dream, Windsor Free Festival was the British answer. Colder, scrappier and far more political. It started quietly in 1972 in the shadow of Windsor Castle on Crown Estate land. A few hundred idealists, radicals, anarchists and heads gathered in Windsor Great Park with tents, acoustic guitars and the kind of optimism that only comes from having nothing to lose. With no tickets, no stages, no bosses. Just the belief that land should be shared, music should be free and life could be lived differently. It wasn't permission they asked for, it was access. In 1973 the crowd had grown into thousands. It was a tangle of families, crusties, freaks, travellers, bikers and straight-up wanderers. Bands played from flatbed trucks, food was communal, drugs plentiful. The vibe was equal part chaos and connection. It wasn't just a festival, it was a living act of defiance against monarchy, property and the state's monopoly on space. A central figure in Britain's radical land rights and alternative living movements was Sid Rule, RIP 2010. Emerging from the London squat scene in the late 1960s, notably the occupation of 144 Piccadilly with the London Street Commune, Sid became known in the press as the King of the Hippies, a title he wore with ironic defiance. He was no wide-eyed idealist. Rule was a strategic organiser, passionate about land reform, communal living and reclaiming space for people. He helped launch the Free Festival in 1972 with the belief that public land, once enclosed by the monarchy, should again be accessible. In his own words and actions, he argued that if the Queen could enjoy thousands of acres of private estate, then ordinary people ought to be allowed a weekend of freedom in a public park. Then there was Wally Ho, born Phil Russell, reborn in robes, incense and sunburst capes. Wally channeled something closer to visionary theatre. He believed festivals were more than gatherings. They were rituals. Music, psychedelics, performance and shared myth could, in his view, rewire consciousness and reclaim sacred space. He strode through the fields like a sun priest, cloaked in feathers and mischief, smiling like someone who knew a secret you hadn't yet remembered. The Stonehenge Free Festival, which he co-initiated in 1974, was not just protest, it was ceremonial defiance, a radical merging of joy, absurdity, and ancient resonance. He even got the event advertised on Radio Caroline and invited, amongst others, the Queen and the Dalai Lama, but I think they were otherwise engaged at the time. Together, they helped to turn Windsor into a spiritual and political lightning rod. But in 1974, it all came crashing down. The state struck back. Hundreds of police officers stormed the camp before the festival could even begin. There were dogs, batons, arrests. Tents were smashed, guitars broken, children caught in the chaos. Sid was arrested, so was Wally. Amnesty International condemned the violence. The government called it a necessary operation. Activists called it a riot. What happened next sealed Wally Hope's transformation from visionary to martyr. In 1974, he was arrested for possession of LSD. He'd already spent some time in prison previously, subsequently sectioned under the Mental Health Act, detained indefinitely without trial, and institutionalised at Knowle Hospital in Hampshire. Reason for his detention was given as schizophrenia, based on the fact that he used Phil Russell and Wally Hope as his names. According to friends and contemporaries, he was subjected to heavy psychiatric medication, which left him sedated and psychologically diminished. Upon his release, he appeared hollowed out. Soon after, he was found dead at his family home. The official verdict was suicide by sleeping pill overdose, but among the counterculture, suspicions of foul play were immediate. Figures such as Penny Rimbold of Crass long contended that Wally's death was politically motivated, a message from the state that those that dream too big, especially those threatening the status quo, would not be tolerated. Whether or not conspiracy is provable, Wally's death left a void and a warning, and became a galvanising myth for the Free Festival movement that followed. Note that a much fuller story of Wally Hope, the myriad of controversy surrounding his life and death, are covered in a much more detail in Paolo Cesari's recent film. See the bibliography. But Wally's spirit refused to die. In 1974, he and a few others had camped near Stonehenge, dreaming of a new kind of festival. In 1975, they returned and brought the seeds of something massive with them. As Windsor was shut down with steel and truncheons, Stonehenge opened its arms. The stones would become the next battleground, the next beacon. Not every festival made the headlines. While Windsor shook the establishment and Stonehenge gathered scale and legend, other festivals flickered in valleys, commons, quarries and woods, building the culture in quieter but equally vital ways. In the wake of the brutal police suppression of Windsor Free Festival in 1974, the British government took an unexpectedly conciliatory turn. Amid public outcry and damning media coverage, the Home Office, led at the time by Roy Jenkins, opted to provide an official venue for a free festival the following year. The site was Watchfield, a disused military base near Swindon, chosen for its seclusion and capacity. It became the only government-sanctioned free festival in British history. The event, held in August 1975, was framed as a controlled experiment, a way to diffuse tension, avoid further confrontation, and accommodate thousands of festival-goers without the optics of state violence. Though not universally loved, Watchfield marked a strange moment of truce. The state, however, briefly allowed the counterculture to breathe. Seriously windy out here, not sure if you can hear it. For a brief moment it worked. Thousands came. Hawkwind played. Wally's Hope's spirit was still fresh in people's minds. There were stalls, political talks, fire pits, kids on shoulders and mushroom-fueled debates about the collapse of civilization. But the truce didn't last. While Watchfield 1975 passed without major incident, it made the authorities uneasy. The sight of thousands of long hairs, sound systems, food co-ops and free living encampments on state land stirred fears in Whitehall. Internal memos from the Home Office and local councils showed growing discomfort, not because the festival failed, but because it worked. It set a precedent. By 1976, the state's posture had shifted back toward control. No further sites were offered. The message was clear. Watchfield had been a one-off, not a new model. Organisers trying to repeat it elsewhere faced red tape, evictions and police resistance. For many in the scene, Watchfield came to symbolise a fragile moment when the system blinked and doubled down. Deeply Vale Festival, 1976 to 1979, up north in a hidden corner of Lancashire, something else was blooming. Deeply Vale Festival near Rochdale started as a gathering of freaks, heads, punks, travellers and local kids who wanted something different, away from the London-centric scenes and southern squabbles. It had no royal backdrop or ancient stones, but what it did have was heart, weirdness, and genuine crossover between musical tribes. Where other festivals split along taste or tribe, Deeply Vale blended. Punk bands played next to prog rockers, crusty folk duos followed DIY synth acts, and the atmosphere was inclusive, messy and buzzing. Here and Now, Steve Hillage, and countless obscure regional outfits played wild, half-eclectic sets on stages built with scaffolding and belief. Kids danced on cowpats, acid mixed with homebrew. Bikers shook hands with anarcho-punks. It wasn't about headliners, it was about participation. Crucially, Deeply Vale helped fuse the free festival movement with punk. Long before Crass put out flyers for Stonehenge, this was where safety pins met patchouli, where you'd see a studded jacket and a didgeridoo in the same tent. That blend, that raw, local, post-industrial DIY ethos would shape what would come next. Others worth remembering. Megan Fair in Wales, held in fields by Preseli Hills, where ley lines and music lines blurred. Psilocybin Valley gatherings, loose, unnamed meetups in the Shrewsbury Meadows of Dorset and Wales. Holtsfield Gower, a small festival scene tied to anti-eviction struggles and land rights. Elton Common, Rivington Pike, Nettlebed. Names mostly forgotten outside of oral history, but places where fires burned and speakers blasted into the night. Free festivals didn't aim to be legendary, but they became the roots of a culture, spaces where trust networks were built, where people learned how to rig stages, fix vans, patch benders, survive rain and old Bill. Trip safely, hold space safe and keep going. They weren't famous, but they made the legend possible. If Windsor had been a political dare and the Isle of Wight a corporate sprawl cracked open by squatters, Stonehenge Free Festival was something else entirely. A ritual, a myth, a magnet. It started small in 1974, seeded by Wally Hope and a few other heads who pitched camp near the ancient stones with little more than a campfire, a guitar and a burning idea. To them, Stonehenge wasn't just history, it was energy. The old monoliths were museum pieces. They were a sacred centre, a cultural focal point for Britain's disenchanted, dispossessed and wild-hearted. In the 1975 gathering returned larger now, stranger, and from there it grew every year. By the late 1970s, Stonehenge Free Festival had become the spiritual capital of the underground, a free zone where hippies, punks, bikers, travellers, anarchists, pagans, druids, dealers, dropouts, squat kids, dogs, ravers in waiting, fire breathers, poets, and those who had nowhere else left all found common ground. There were no fences, no tickets, no permission. Just a month-long sprawl across the Salisbury Plain, centred around the solstice. You could arrive any day in June and find something happening. A band, a ritual, fire, a new family. Sound systems ran all night. People played to the stones at dawn. One field might host Hawkwind's space rock odysseys, the next a crew of anarcho bunks blowing out a battered PA rig. And in the background, the druids. Some were serious spiritual practitioners, clad in white robes and deep in ceremony. Others were anarcho pranksters with tinfoil horns and plastic scythes. But all of them added a sense of timelessness to the madness, the feeling that what was happening wasn't just fun or protest, but a kind of return to land, to ritual, to something ancient outside the law. State, of course, hated it. Ministry of Defence owned the land. The old bill hovered constantly, but they didn't yet know how to crush it. Stonehenge had no leaders, no organisers. If you took one bender down, another would pop up. If you arrested someone, 3 more took their place. The sheer scale of it, the fact that it was tied to something as culturally untouchable as the ancient monument itself, made it a logistical and political headache. By the end of the 1970s, Stonehenge Free Festival had outgrown every attempt to contain it. It was a cultural organism, part protest, part pilgrimage, part open-air asylum. People showed up from all over Europe. Drugs were openly marketed on chalkboards, convoys rolled in from squats in London and Birmingham. Rumours spread that ley lines converged under the stones. You could find hash dealers, rune readers, army dropouts and French punk collectives all in the same stretch of mud. And yet, for all its chaos, Stonehenge showed a strange kind of order. No corporate logos, no headline acts, just a commitment to being there, free, loud, alive and unlicensed. 1980s would bring confrontation. Babylon would regroup. But for now, for those years, at the tail end of the 1970s, Stonehenge was ours. Here's a table of the number of estimated attendees. So you can see it went from around 500 in 1974, 1975 1,000, 76 2,000, then 5,000, 7,000, 10,000, 12,000, and you can see by 1984 we were up to 35 to nearly 40,000 people. Note the zero at 1985. We'll cover that in the later chapter on the Battle of the Beanfield. 86 back to around 500, 87 around 500, and so on until it was completely cancelled. Note that the winter solstice at Stonehenge has long held spiritual and symbolic significance, both in ancient times and in modern countercultural gatherings. Archaeological evidence suggests that the monument was originally aligned to mark the winter solstice sunset, rather than the summer sunrise as commonly believed. For Neolithic communities, this darkest day of the year signified renewal, a turning point when the sun begins to return, offering hope of survival through winter. While the summer solstice became the focus of the massive free festivals discussed, the winter solstice remained smaller, more intimate, more led by modern druid groups like the Order of the Bards, Ovates and Druids. Even after the Battle of the Beanfield and the militarised exclusion zones that followed, solstice seekers continued to arrive, in smaller numbers to mark the moment in quiet ceremony or peaceful defiance. There is also always a small gathering for the spring equinox in Beltane. Today, the winter solstice is officially recognised at Stonehenge. English heritage opens the site before dawn, and modern pagans, druids and curious visitors gather to witness the sunrise over the Heelstone. Though the scale is modest compared to the summer, the atmosphere is often more reflective, spiritual and less commercialised, keeping alive the ancient and contemporary conditions of solstice reverence at this iconic site.